أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. محمد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته, dear brothers and sisters. Welcome to the fourth lesson on logic, where we'll be continuing off from where we left off last week. And we're running a bit late on the schedule. We're not following the syllabus 100%. We're one day off, which is fine. We had a few technical issues last week, trying to push us a bit back. So I'll try to finish what was scheduled for last week, this week. I'll amend the syllabus, and then hopefully we can keep up with the actual timeline that we have for the course. What we're going to do today is we're going to go and have a recap from last week. We're trying to move on from this point over here. Last week we spoke about the divisions of knowledge, and we said that this specific chapter is not part of logic per se. This is to do with epistemology. It has to do with the human mind and how the human perceives and conceives of different ideas and how the human being understands the world around him. But we need to know what knowledge is and how the human mind functions, because we want to understand where logic fits into place. Why is logic necessary? What kind of science is it? Why has it even been developed? And how could it help us as human beings? What is it that it does for us? So without understanding the purpose of a science or why we should do something, we won't be motivated to do it, and we won't be able to benefit from it practically in our daily lives, if it does have any benefit. So this is why the scholars looked into knowledge and try to understand what knowledge is, how the human being reacts with the world inside of himself and the world surrounding him in order to understand the world and observe it and understand it. And then they wanted to see how humans understand truth statements or understand the truth in any argumentation. They saw that we talk to each other, we describe things, and we differ when we describe things as well. So why does this differing happen? Why does it occur? Why do people have different opinions? Why do they sometimes even have contradictory opinions? Why does this happen? So they divided knowledge into knowledge by presence and knowledge by correspondence. When you look at the human being, they saw that the human understands things in two different ways. There's things that he understands that are outside of him, and he understands the external world outside of himself. His observation of everything around him happens through conceptualization. So as a human being, I look at this wall over here, or I look at a chair, or I look at a table, and what is my relationship with these objects? How do I understand what these external objects are? I mean, the wall is not inside of me. The chair is not inside of me. It's not present. Me and the chair are not part of one thing. The chair is outside of me. So how do I connect to the chair? How do I understand what this chair is? How do I conceive of it? That's one issue. The second thing they saw is that humans are aware of their internal feelings and their own existence, their consciousness. This is not something external to us. We know ourselves through ourselves, and we interact with things outside of us using our own consciousness. So they said that there are two different things that we know, or two different ways of knowing things. One of them is that which is ourselves and everything related to it. So our own feelings, our own emotions, our own, let's say, dreams or visions, whatever's going on internally. This is something that's to do with the person himself, not the outside world. And then there are things that are in the outside world. So those which are internal in the human being, they called knowledge by presence. This is what they named it. And that which is external, they've called it knowledge by correspondence. There's an activity of corresponding with something in the mind. So by correspondence, it doesn't have to be an object necessarily. It could be a definition. It could be a notion. The point is that the thing itself is not present, but a form of it is present. A definition of it is present. The object itself is not present in the human being. And we said that logic is not concerned with knowledge by presence. That's something that's outside of the scope of logic. And it's concerned with knowledge by correspondence. So we eliminated this over here and we explained why. And then we said that knowledge by correspondence could be divided into two different categories as well. That which happens through conception and assent. And we had a question yesterday on the group regarding conception. In reality, knowledge is conceptualization. This type of knowledge here, knowledge by correspondence, is conceptualization. But when they looked at human beings and them conceptualizing things, they noticed that sometimes we conceptualize certain things and it remains a concept. And sometimes we actually believe that concept that we have in ourselves, in our minds. So they said, okay, let's differentiate between the two. Sometimes we only have the conceptualization, which they call simple conceptualization. And then sometimes that concept, we believe in it. So I'll imagine that, you come and tell me that there is a new restaurant that opened up in the city nearby, and you give me a name for it. So I get to form an image in my mind. Now, depending on how much I believe you, I either believe your statement, not believe you, or just leave it out there as a possibility. So first I conceptualize what you said, and the moment I verify it, either by going there and seeing it, or I trust you so much that I would not doubt what you told me, then I would believe in what you said. I'll have assent in it. And this is a very different category from just pure conception. Your beliefs in God and the hereafter, your ideology, climate change, anything you have, if you have strong belief in it, it would fall under this category over here. And you would argue to prove it. And you would actually, let's say, society would establish laws based on their convictions. So there's a lot of implications and a lot of things that follow from having assent as human beings. But most of the time, if we just have a conception of something, it doesn't have much effect as assent would on the external world. But it also does have an effect. But we'll go into that later on today. We'll see how these two, what kind of roles they play in the human soul. So now we'll move on from last week. And we want to say that both assent and conception can be divided into axiomatic assent and cognitive assent, and axiomatic conception and cognitive conception as well. And this is, I think, where we ended last week. And we said that there's a difference between an assent that occurs without thinking, without contemplation, and assent that has to occur through thinking and contemplation. So let's say you believe in your own existence. I exist, for example. And you have assent in that the actual notion that I, so-and-so exist, and you believe in it. Or, for example, the law of non-contradiction. And that's an axiom, they say, that a thing cannot exist and not exist at the same time and place. So something, I can't say that, this chair exists and does not exist in the same time and space and all the conditions. It both exists and does not exist. This is something that I don't have to demonstrate. The mind just automatically understands it. And you believe in that. So the law of non-contradiction would be an example of an axiom that we believe in and we assent in without really having to contemplate and to think. But then you have a lot of issues where you have to sit there and look at proofs and evidences. So let's say the theory of evolution or creation, the existence of a God, for example. Some people would categorize that as cognitive, because you would have to demonstrate proofs and argue for the existence of a deity. And that also really depends on the time and space that the place that you're living in. So at one point in time, there not being so many, let's say, misconceptions or ideas floating around, maybe understanding that a God exists is much simpler and easier than, let's say, a time where during the Renaissance, let's say when the church and the state separated, science became dominant. People began doubting the authority of the church and the existence of God. They didn't completely doubt it, but it began at that time and eventually developed into what Europe is going through nowadays. So now to prove the existence of a God became cognitive. It might have been axiomatic before. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because we're going to see Shaykh in his book, he says that some things are axiomatic, but we just don't grasp them. We don't understand they're axiomatic because of certain things that prevent us from doing that. But we'll go into that in a little bit. So there are issues that I need to believe in through argumentation, and they require proofs and evidences. And there are things that people understand without even having to think about that. This would be axiomatic assent. At the same time, conceptualizing things. It's also divided into these categories as well. And I'll move over here so we can have the definitions. Axiomatic self-evident knowledge is a knowledge that does not require thought, acquisition, reflection. It occurs spontaneously, is self-evident. Cognitive reflection or knowledge is that which requires acquisition and reflection. Okay, now, axiomatic conception. Our conceptions of existence and non-existence. These are things that we don't have to think about in order to conceive them. They just automatically occur to the mind. Axiomatic assent. Our assent that the whole all right, so here I divided the categories into axiomatic and cognitive, not assent and conception. So let me go back. Okay, so we have axiomatic conception, conceiving of existence and non-existence, and axiomatic assent is our assent that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that two contradictories or contradictions cannot be joined, or that the sun has risen, or that one is half of two, and so on and so forth. We have cognitive conception, and again, this is our conceptions of existence and non-existence, and cognitive assent, our assent about whether the Earth is stationary, or if it's orbits on its own axis, or orbits around the sun. So these are issues that require thought and reflection, and they don't just occur to the mind automatically. Now, in order for a person to become aware of an axiom, something that is supposed to be self-evident, let's say, what are the conditions that have to be in the human being in order for this to happen? First of all, this is from Shaykh Muzafar's book, which I sent on the group. And he mentions these 5 conditions over here. First of all, there has to be attention, and I'll explain those in a moment. There has to be health in mind, health in senses, lack of confusion, and non-intellective operations. These are the 5 conditions that have to exist in order for something to be understood as self-evident, something self-evident to be understood by a human being. So what does he mean by these? Well, he says that in order to understand or be aware of something that's self-evident, there has to be attention in the human being. So this is something that's universally needed for all axioms. A person has to be able to be directed towards the thing and not distracted from it. He says that someone who is not properly paying attention, things can be ignorant of even the most obvious truths. So sometimes, there's something that's so obvious while you're talking to someone, and it's just so obvious, but because they're not paying attention to the obviousness of the issue, they just don't grasp it and they don't get it. So they're not paying attention to the actual issue. So you have to be directed towards it, and you have to be able to realize what this issue that's being discussed is in order to realize whether it's self-evident or not. The second condition is that you have to have health in mind. This is an unchangeable cause as well. A person may be ill in his mind and doubt in the most manifest of truths, or not understand them. This kind of malady can derive from a physical deficiency or accidental illness or a bad upbringing. So I guess when he's referring to the health of mind, he's not just referring to the physical mind. He's referring to a person not being, let's say, brainwashed as a child, someone who has not been, indoctrinated in a certain way. So you have, some families that indoctrinate their children, some countries that indoctrinate their children, and self-evident notions such as, let's say, justice. Some people might conceive justice as being in need for justice for human beings as an axiom. This is something that's self-evident. Nobody has to argue that justice is a good thing for human beings and it must prevail. You might find someone from different countries who would adopt that notion. They would argue against, justice being central or necessary for human beings. And you have that kind of debate in the elections right now. So, for example, not too long ago, an argument was made for healthcare. That healthcare is a necessary human right. For basically everybody should have healthcare. You have people on their side. These people that say that it's a basic human right, right? So they're assuming it's a self-evident thing. It makes sense. It's so obvious that everybody should have access to healthcare. On the other hand, you have people who would argue against that. That no, why should there be universal healthcare? And they would actually make arguments and debate individuals regarding this. So this might be something that fits into this whole scenario. You might say that because this person was not taught, or not necessarily taught, he was taught that human beings don't have value in themselves. He might have this corrupt idea in his mind, which lets him not realize the self-evidency of, let's say, universality of healthcare as a human right. So that could be an issue with the health in mind. The third condition he has here is health in senses. And he says that this is specific to those axioms that are related to the five senses. So let's say a blind person or someone weak in his eyes will have difficulty in understanding visual perceptions, as would a deaf person in trying to understand auditory perceptions, or someone without taste perception. So let's say the sun rising. Say that the sun has risen. And a blind person or someone who cannot see cannot verify that. So he might not be able to conceive it. He wouldn't believe it because of a problem in his senses. Number 4, lack of confusion. He says that confusion results from the mind using false evidences to deny an axiom and is ignorant of its fallacies. So in logic, we have this section where they discuss fallacies in argumentation. Some people would base a whole argument based on a fallacy. And what logic does is it shows to you that this way of thinking is incorrect. So if the mind is thinking using fallacies, and therefore from this fallacy, he doesn't realize what's self-evident, then it doesn't change the self-evidency of the self-evident thing. The thing is self-evident, but the person is not realizing that it's self-evident because of some confusion that he has in his mind. And the fifth issue that he has over here is that being a non-intellective operation. He says that many axioms require non-intellective operations. And again, I put this all over here because this is not in the book that we're studying. And I thought for reviewing, you would have all of this on the slides. Otherwise, I don't like to have this much many words on slides. He says that many axioms require non-intellective operations. One may hear a report from many people, so many that it's impossible for them to have all conspired to lie about that thing. This would be one of the axioms of tawatur. Or one may do experiments, and this would be from the experimental axioms. Or a person may put effort into going to see another land or to hear a voice, and this would involve the axioms of sense perception. In order to gain knowledge in these ways, a person may have to have considerable experience or trouble into something. I think I need to correct that. There are some errors in the English book. Anyways, so the point here is that the criteria he says is that a person does not need thought or reflection or of any kind or any kind of intellectual operation to arrive at these kinds of knowledge. So we'll get into these later. This is not part of these issues are not part of the book. I just added them in order for us to understand that sometimes there are things that are self-evident and people don't realize that this is self-evident. And it's not because the thing is not self-evident in itself. It's because there's an issue with the human being not being able to realize that there's a barrier going on. So this is basically the summary of these points. And it's not required for the class, but I just wanted to show that we can delve into deeper issues, hopefully maybe in a different course in the future, inshallah. So this is a summary of the concepts that we went through regarding knowledge. We said that knowledge is divided into two categories, by correspondence, by presence. And then this is not concerned with logic, or logic is not concerned with it. Then by correspondence can be divided into conception and assent. And then each one is divided into cognitive and axiomatic categories. Now, so at the beginning of the course, we said that logic is trying to reach the unknown using the knowns that we have, this process of thinking. So basically that implies that as human beings, we have things that we're unaware of, we're ignorant of. And that's why they define ignorance as being the lack of knowledge. In logic or in philosophy, usually it's binary. You have existence and you have non-existence. So the existence of a form and an image in the mind would be called knowledge. The lack of that form or the non-existence of that form in the mind would be called ignorance. So the existence of something, they call it knowledge. The lack of it is called ignorance. Just like how logicians would categorize light and darkness. They would say that light is existent. The lack of light is darkness. And similarly, when it comes to the ideas of, or the notions of good and evil, when it comes to God, they say that evil is non-existent. They make that argument because you understand things from an existential point of view. Good is existential, and all evil is just a lack of good. Evil doesn't exist in itself. So this binary or existential way of thinking is how binary logic works, which is what we're dealing with over here. So if knowledge is existent, knowledge is the presence of the idea or the form or the image in the mind, ignorance would be the lack of that knowledge. When we don't know something that can be known, we are ignorant of it. So let's say that I'm able to know that there is a 12th planet orbiting around the sun that we're not aware of. I'm able to know it, but I just don't know it. Just the mere fact that I can know that makes me ignorant of it. Since knowledge is contrasted with ignorance, they share the same categories. So wherever there's knowledge, the lack of that knowledge would be ignorance in that thing. So it would share the exact same categories, which means that every unknown matter that could become knowable through conception is conceptual ignorance. So all the definitions that I don't know of, all the forms and images that I don't know that I could know, that is called conceptual ignorance, because I'm ignorant of those concepts that I could know, that are knowable. Every unknown matter that could become knowable through assent is called assenting ignorance. So any proposition or predicative sentence, like we mentioned last week, that I'm able to assent in. So let's say I say that Mars is yellow. This sentence over here. I could either believe that or deny it. And because it has that potential, but I did not have assent in it yet. I still didn't make a decision, but it has a potential for me to believe it or not believe it, then I'm ignorant in the assent of that proposition. And why this is important is because what the logician is trying to tell us here is that we use logic in order for us to try to arrive at the unknowns. Now, if there's something that we can know, but we just haven't known it yet for whatever reason it is, the logician here helps us organize our thoughts and our minds in order for us to discover these unknowns, this whole process of thinking. Now, when it comes to ignorance, there's an issue that they talk about as well. And there's a difference of opinion in this matter over here. This is not part of the book that we have. It's part of Shaykh Mullaffa's book. And even Shaykh Mullaffa, when he mentions it, you don't find this really in a lot of the books that the logicians have wrote. There's a whole discussion over this issue over here. And I'll explain it to you, trying to summarize the idea, not delve too much into it, but just so you become aware of it, because you might hear scholars talking about compound ignorance and simple ignorance. And I thought it would be beneficial for us to kind of go over this, just to kind of get an idea of what they might be talking about. They say that ignorance could be divided into two: simple ignorance and compound ignorance. Again, simple here, whenever we use simple in logic, like simple conception, simple ignorance, it means that which is not connected with something else. It's not compound. It's not made up of two different things. It's just pure ignorance. Just like simple conception is conception without judgment. It's just conception itself. If you add judgment to it, it's not simple anymore. It's compound. And they call it compound conception. They called it assent. So ignorance, we have something that is simple ignorance, and we have compound, which means it's ignorance plus something else. It's made up of ignorance and another thing. So what is this other thing that it's made up of? Well, let's define simple ignorance first. Simple ignorance is when someone is ignorant about something, but he's aware of his ignorance. So I know that I don't know whether there is life on other planets or not. I know I'm aware of my ignorance, and I'm cognitive of it. So here the Shaykh, he gives an example of the motion of Mars. We're ignorant about the motion of Mars. We don't know whether or not Mars is in motion, but at least we know that we don't know. And so in reality, we only have one kind of ignorance, just ignorance of that thing over here, that Mars is in motion. Compound ignorance would be not knowing the thing, and it's combined with ignorance about one's own ignorance. So we have two kinds of ignorances here. I'm ignorant of the actual thing, and I'm ignorant that I'm ignorant of it. A person believes that he has knowledge where he does not. In this case, one does not know that one is ignorant. All the people with false beliefs would fall into this category. They believe that they are knowledgeable about the reality of things, but are ignorant in reality. So let's say now the flat earthers, right? They believe that Earth is flat. Again, I'm not arguing or debating this whole issue. I'll leave that to whoever is interested in that kind of debate. But let's say we have there's satellites, out there, and people are into space now, and they're gone, and I think they've landed on Mars and other planets, and still we have people who think that Earth is flat, not a sphere, not round, and they believe that. So let's say that in reality, Earth is a sphere. So they're ignorant of the fact that Earth is a sphere, and they're also ignorant of that ignorance that they have, because they think that they're not ignorant. They believe that the Earth is flat. So they're not aware of their ignorance in the spiritual shape of the Earth. This is more difficult to deal with. And some mystical scholars say that if you want to purify a person who has compound ignorance, if you bring all the water of the ocean on Earth, the ocean, and try to purify this person's soul, you won't be able to purify it, because these people are very arrogant. If he has belief in his own ignorance, in the false beliefs that he has, it's very difficult to convince him otherwise. So first of all, you have to make him aware that he's ignorant of this truth. And that's the most difficult part. once you do that, then you can try to teach him what the truth is. Whereas someone who's aware of his ignorance, all you have to do is you have to show him the truth, and they'll just accept it. This other guy, it's a bigger challenge. And that's why if you go on YouTube or you go online, I mean, they have videos, and they're just debating, and people spend hours and hours drawing graphs and coming up with theories about how NASA's conspiracy and trying to
Compounding. Your compounding.
Yeah, you have to make him aware of his ignorance. He doesn't think he's ignorant.
It can't be introspective. Compounding.
What's that? You can elaborate.
You reflecting on it, you'll never reach. Someone outside has to come and tell you.
Okay, so you're saying, I'm going to repeat it so they can hear the question in case they didn't hear it. You're asking whether compound ignorance would require an external thing that would awaken an individual or make him aware of his own ignorance. Yes, because he doesn't see himself as ignorant in the first place. It's an actual belief in him. And this is where the whole debate comes in. They debate whether compound ignorance is part of ignorance or is it part of knowledge. Because a person has belief. So is it really ignorance? Or is it part of knowledge? It's just that it's false knowledge. There's a big debate between the logicians in this matter. And the reason why is because when you come to define knowledge, Aristotle, for example, and others would define knowledge as something that corresponds with the external reality, not something that is just internal to the human being. Just because I have a belief doesn't make that knowledge. That belief has to correspond with truth in order for it to become knowledge. On the other hand, you have people that might define knowledge as just pure belief, whether it corresponds with truth or it doesn't correspond with truth. And this is where the difference of opinion occurs. And I think it's a very interesting debate. I would love to delve into and kind of hear your opinions as well on the matter, but I think it's outside of the scope of this class right now. Maybe if anyone's interested after class or let's say on chat, for example, if anybody wants to delve more into this, we can do that. Shaykh Mulafan in the book that I sent, he has a section that deals with compound ignorance being part of knowledge or ignorance. So maybe if you're interested, you can read that. And if you want to discuss the idea, I can provide more references and sources that would help us try to, adopt an opinion in this matter. So how do we come to remove the ignorance that we have? These unknowns, these infinite amount of unknowns that exist outside of us and inside of us. How do we end up removing them? Conceptual ignorance, it occurs through definitions, through forming of concepts. And assenting ignorance, you would have to remove that by assenting in certain things, by believing in certain things. That's how you remove that kind of ignorance and unknowns. So because this is what conceptualization is divided into, logic is a science that teaches us the correct way to reaching conceptual unknowns and assenting unknowns. So if you want to define something, want to conceptualize something, logic teaches us how to conceptualize it in the correct way. And if we want to believe in something, logic will teach us how to reach a certain truth through a proper method of argumentation or a syllogism or something of that sort. So the subject matter, therefore, of logic is definitions and evidences. That's why when we go next week, let's say, we're going to begin with trying to study language and words. We have to learn how to form definitions and concepts, which methods are incorrect when it comes to defining things, and understanding conceptualizations, and which methods are correct. That's the first section of logic. The second section of logic deals with syllogisms and truth and false statements. And that's the part over here, assenting ignorance, removing that. I wanted to add a point over here before moving on. This doesn't exist in the book, and usually it's not really discussed in logic either. But I wanted to mention a point regarding conceptualization. Yes.
Last time, sorry. Definitions.
Yeah.
I thought that was a paper.
It seems like it is. I put it there because that's the word that was used in the book. Yeah. So basically, it's just like definition, how to define things. But it's the translation that they used, the word that they used in the translation of the book that we're using. What definitions? I'm trying. Sometimes I prefer a translation over another, but I can't put my own preference all the time because we are using a book. And even though it might not be the best translation, I'm trying to stick with the word in the book just in case someone reads the book, he's able to become aware that this is what we're talking about. But yeah, basically it's definition. If you don't like the word, you can always delete it and put your own thing over it. So moving beyond conceptualization. If we conceive something, what comes after this conception? I mean, do we perfect ourselves as human beings through conceptualizing truths and assenting in them? Is that how we perfect ourselves as human beings? Or is there something that comes beyond this level of conception? If you recall, when we talked about the different levels of the different modes of knowledge in the human being, we said that there's the essential perception, and we have the rational, and we have the supra-rational, which is the intuitive. And we said that logic deals with the middle one, and it understands things through reason, and it understands the world around it and truth through the mind and the rational faculty. Now, if you perfect your rational faculty and you're able to argue in a very sound manner, and you reach truth through your argumentation, is that how a human being perfects himself? Is that where we stop as human beings? If we have all the correct beliefs and we have all the correct convictions, is that enough for us? When it comes to certain belief systems, there are, certain denominations of religion, certain, strands of a religion that do believe that all you have to have in order to reach salvation is correct belief. When you believe in God, you believe in the prophet, you believe in the book and the law, and you have a correct belief system, and you believe in the law, obviously you apply the law. But what matters most is that your belief is correct. That's why if you have an incorrect belief, you would be considered to be an apostate or an infidel. Even Muslims, between themselves, someone who differs with another group of Muslims on a certain belief, they would remove him from religion and therefore consider him to be worthy of going to hell or even killed in some instances. So they give a lot of weight to the idea of believing, assenting in truth, having a proper belief system. And they use that as a criteria for the perfection of human beings. Is that something that's correct or incorrect? Is that something that we believe is in correspondence with truth or not? He asked some scholars, and they would tell you yes. There's nothing beyond conceptualization. As long as you have a proper belief system and you're doing your own duties, you go to heaven, and that's it. That's all you have to do. Even if, as a human being, you don't experience anything spiritual. You don't increase your intuitive knowledge. These people don't even believe necessarily any type of intuitive knowledge. Or if they do believe in it, they don't believe it's our job or duty to even deal with that kind of stuff. We just have to ignore it. The only person who has proper intuitive knowledge would be the Prophet and the Imams. They taught us through their knowledge was to believe. All we have to do is just submit, believe, and listen to this word because we want to go to heaven with the correct belief system. You have scholars, on the other hand, who realize that the movement of the human being is a movement towards perfection. It's a spiritual movement, essentially. And rationalization and conceptualization is just a means for humans that would assist him or her on the spiritual path to reaching perfection. So if we look at the ultimate goal in life, we have to decide for ourselves whether, rationalization and being in conformity with truth on the irrational level is what's required of us as human beings, and that's our ultimate goal in life, or that we are expected to move beyond this. We're expected to use that rationalization, correct it, rectify it, in order for us to be able to move beyond it and reach higher truths that are more internal and spiritual. If we look at the irrational path, it has to do with conceptualizing truth. And the sciences that deal with this are logic, philosophy, mathematics, etc. These help us correct the way we think, the way we understand the world around us. Knowing that, let's say, that a God who is, let's say, we define, again, definitions. Let's say we define God as the ultimate and absolute being who has no partners and no associates because he's just absolute in his nature, as opposed to believing that there are multiple gods in the universe. This might be an incorrect way of thinking. How could you have multiple gods if each one of them is absolute? Then you cannot have multiple absolutes existing in the same place, in the same time and whatnot. So this would help us understand things on that level. So let's say I understood that there can only be one God and there cannot be multiple gods. That would really affect my way of understanding the world around me. And it would even affect the way I deal with things in my own life. If I believe that there's one God who is absolute, then I would resort to him. And if that absolute God is someone who is able to hear me, and I'm able to unify myself with him, and I'm able to realize him for my own self, then I would walk on a different path than if I thought there were multiple gods. One of them that was responsible for, let's say, casting, lightning. One was responsible for rain. And, each God is responsible for a different kind of thing. Then I would behave differently with these deities. My relationship with them would be a different relationship. Then we have the spiritual path, understanding truths through spiritual realization, something that goes beyond reason. It's true that I might understand that there is only one God in this universe. This God is the absolute and, let's say, the origin of being itself, or actually he is being itself. If I understand it through my mind, it doesn't necessarily make me aware or make me realize it's God. I can understand the notion, but I don't necessarily have any practical, doesn't have any practical implications. Something that happens to me. So if I know that, let's say I know that God forbids a certain thing, gambling, let's say. I can still go and gamble. I know the notion, correct way of thinking, it's a conviction that I have. And but that doesn't really have any effect outside of the mind. In the spiritual path, though, we don't just try to conceptualize truth. We try to move beyond that. And you try to unify yourself with that truth that you're believing in. And this is what mysticism does. This is where it comes into play. People who thought that we want to move beyond conceptualization. It's true that I have the correct belief system and I have the correct ideas and I don't make mistakes in my thought, but I don't experience God. I don't experience the truth that I'm believing in. And something that's experiential is that knowledge by presence. There's a difference between knowing God through notions and thoughts and ideas, and conceptualizing him, and knowing God through the heart, knowing him by presence. Concepts and images and forms are mediators. They do no good in themselves if not transcendent. So if you have an idea about God and you have a conceptualization about God, then just knowing that in itself does you no good. It's important to know it because without knowing it, you cannot transcend it. So it's necessary to know these ideas. Otherwise, you will not be able to move towards something if you can't conceptualize it. And this is the point that I tried making over here. If you don't transcend them, they themselves become veils. Because the more you know about something, human nature is that it becomes arrogant. I think just because I know something now, it makes me a good person, or it makes me above other people, or that I've reached the truth. A lot of people try to read books on mysticism, Irfan and Sufism, or a hadith, let's say in the Quran, and they become very well versed in these kinds of things, and they can tell you all these notions and principles, and they have them known by heart. But yet, when you look at them in their daily lives, they're nothing related to what they're talking about. They could be talking about this mystical union with God. But you look at him, and he's the most indulging person in the dunya. That's because he hasn't realized the truth. He hasn't become one with it. He hasn't applied it in his own life. He just has these notions. He has the correct concepts in his mind, but he didn't move beyond that. So movement from the irrational to the super-rational, from the conceptual to the super-conceptual, from the image to the imageless, and from the form to the formless. This is what the objective of a human being should be. And I drew a model over here, which we're going to go into, and I'll show you why ideation or conception is necessary for human beings. But before going into that, let's think of this verse that God talks about in the Quran. It says, "We shall show them our signs upon the horizons and within themselves till it becomes clear to them that He, God, is the truth. Does it not suffice that thy Lord is witness over all things?" God is talking about two different ways of knowing things, two different signs that He reveals to human beings. One of them is the signs that are upon the horizons. These are things that are outside of the human being. And then there are signs within the self, the truth that exists within the human being. And if you put those together and you transcend them, then you get to know God as truth. You unify with Him. That's why God said, He'll show us the signs. We need the signs in order for us to realize what's beyond the sign. Without the mediator, we don't know that there is an object that exists over there. Like we mentioned last week. If I don't have the image of the tree, for example, then I won't know that a tree exists. And since this is, you can, what I've tried doing here is using certain notions that, or words that exist in philosophical books or books on mysticism. They divide the macrocosm and microcosm, basically the world outside of the human being and the world inside of the human being. And putting these signs together, transcending them, you reach this God realization. Rational knowledge, again, it goes through syllogisms when it comes to assenting in our beliefs. And we have, affirmation where you believe in something, and negation when you believe that something is false. So here it's believing something is true. This is believing something is false, or believing that something is not a thing. Now, this division is important because when it comes to theology and philosophy, these sciences deal with God, but they deal with what God is and what God isn't. They're trying to, come up with a proper conception of God. And that's all they do. Philosophy is the same thing as well. Philosophy is a science that deals with understanding existence and being in itself. Understanding the truth about our own existence, but through concepts again. Philosophy doesn't make a person a God-realizing individual or God-wearing individual. It will give you a much clearer understanding of who God is or what existence is. And through that understanding, let's say you understand that the goal is immaterial, the soul is immaterial, and that the soul is on a journey towards perfection. Once you understand that, then you are able to embark on a journey towards God, because you believe that this is what the soul does. If you don't believe the soul is immaterial, then you wouldn't seek anything that purifies the soul or moves the soul towards perfection, because you don't believe in this notion that existence is constantly in a movement towards perfection. So philosophy would teach you that existence is in a constant motion towards perfection. And the soul is in this journey towards this perfection. You would understand that through philosophy, and you need it because without philosophy, specifically Islamic philosophy that deals with existence, you wouldn't understand this notion. That's why most people don't think of the world in this way. But in Islamic philosophy, this is their understanding of the world. That's why the notions of moving towards perfection and the immaterial soul, and that exists after death, and this is what occurs to it after death, is all part of the Islamic worldview, specifically in the Islamic philosophical worldview. We're able to conceive that, and for conceiving that, we want to embark on that journey towards perfection. That's what philosophy does, Islamic philosophy specifically. But that's knowing God through reason. And theology is the same way. We study theology, we study God's attributes, what God is, what God isn't. God is alive, God has knowledge, God is not ignorant, God is not unjust, God is just. And you build this notion and understanding of who God is through theology and through philosophy, but it stops there. It doesn't move you towards any type of perfection. Some people believe that perfecting reason is what human perfection is. They see human perfection through reason and not necessarily through the spirituality. This is something that they might see as extra or even not necessary. But the mystics, on the other hand, said that we have to know God through the Spirit. We understand that God is merciful through the mind, but if we don't realize that He's merciful, we don't experience His mercy, we don't unify with that attribute of God through contemplation, through prayer, through negating the self, then we really haven't reached the truth at all. So, and if this is the case, should reason be abandoned? You have schools of mysticism that say that reason is not necessary. Why not just, sit down in the morning, every day, meditate, contemplate, spiritual activity, do adhkar, do dua, Quran, and why don't you move towards spiritual self-realization without having to have mediators? Without ilm. Why should I take ilm from the book when I can take the ilm directly from God? Why should I study philosophy or theology and these things when I can take it directly from the source? And there's been a dispute throughout history, and it still exists until now, not just in the Islamic world, but in other religions as well, regarding a specific point. Why should we focus a lot on these rational sciences? Why don't we just go directly towards God and not deal with logic, philosophy, theology, and all these other sciences? Really benefit us. In fact, it makes us more arrogant. And if you know things through conception, concepts are always limited. They're limited by how you define them, by the words that are used. But the soul is able to realize things that are limitless, or boundless. So why should I occupy myself with these kinds of sciences? Well, I try to make an argument for reason. And I came up with this chart over here, which I took from the Elements of Islamic Metaphysics of Allama al-Tabari, Bidayat al-Hikmah, when he talks about voluntary acts. That's a book on Islamic philosophy, which is taught in the Hujjah at an advanced level. And he was trying to prove that every voluntary act has a cause in the chapter on cause and effect. And I took that idea and I thought I could apply it to this notion over here. Now, he said that for a person to have a voluntary act or a voluntary movement, then these steps have to be fulfilled. First of all, the person has to have knowledge of that thing. He should have ideation, conceptualization. If, let's say, and this is an example I usually give, if someone is hungry and has to get up and get food to remove that hunger, well, first of all, he has to conceive of his hunger. He has to conceive of the fact that there is food which he can eat that would remove his hunger. We all do that whenever we're sitting down and we're hungry. We become aware immediately of our own hunger. That's knowledge by presence. Then we are aware that I am hungry, that conceptualization over there. So the feeling of hunger is by presence. Knowing that I'm hungry, understanding that I'm hungry, forming an image of my hunger that I am hungry is a conceptualization. believing that I'm hungry because of the feeling that I have, that's assent, and then believing or conceiving, first of all, that I can remove the hunger by eating that pizza that's on the countertop over there, and believing that that would remove my hunger, is things I have to imagine first, conceptualize. And then believing in that, once I believe in it, and depending on how strong my belief is in that thing, or the necessity of how hungry I am, it will create a desire in myself to get up and get that food. Now, I might believe that I'm hungry, I'm starving actually, but I might be someone who is just very lazy. And I'm battling between my laziness and my feeling of wanting to remove my hunger. So until my hunger is strong enough, and let's say I believe that if I don't get up and eat now, I'm going to faint, I'm going to lose my consciousness, something's going to happen to me, I'm going to end up in the ER. That would create a strong enough desire inside of a human being to get up and get the food. And it will give him once he decides, he gets the willpower to get up and do it, and then he'll end up going and getting that food to feed himself. Now, this is why it's necessary to conceptualize things, because this is where ideation, conception, Adam is divided into conception and assent over here. This step over here is necessary to create a movement towards God. If you don't understand that there's a God who is perfect, you're able to become one with and perfect yourself through a God that is merciful, that you can pray to and speak with, and he answers your prayer. If you don't have all these ideas in your mind, you wouldn't do anything in your life that would fulfill that goal that you have in your mind here. That's why you see someone who doesn't believe in God or believes in a different type of God, their behavior in this world differs very much from someone who has, let's say, a more deep conception of God. Let's say, even within one religion, those who conceptualize mystical truths, as opposed to those who see that religion is just a legal system. Their behavior and their understanding of religion and their movement in their lives differs drastically from one another. A person who sees that he perfects himself through salat would perfect his prayer, and he believes that this prayer is elevating him spiritually. A person who just thinks that salah is only a wajib, obligatory prayer, and I just have to do it so I can go to heaven, regardless of whatever experience I have, it's not important, then you see him throughout the day, he just prays and he ends it, and that's it. He feels like he did his duty. And this is all because of this over here. How you understand God and how you understand the truth and reality affects your movement in life and your movement towards whatever goal that you conceive. That's why we can't abandon this part. Again, mysticism. If you don't understand properly what God is, you won't know how to reach him, even mystically speaking. I'm going to end the lesson here. This is lesson 3 of the book. Very short, and lesson 4, there are 2 short chapters. Next week, inshallah, we can finish them and hopefully start with lesson 5, inshallah, after that. والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.